Despot's game is loaded with charm and personality and all the animations, characters, and events that you find. But is it worth buying as a whole? Let's get into it. Despot's game is an autobattler roguelite in a dystopian setting. You build up a team of pink humans you can equip with different items and weapons that you find. You fight through a series of levels, each of which have branching rooms, and in each room, you set up your little army of men as you see fit to fight the enemy. Once the fight starts, they'll attack the enemy on their own accord in AI, as is the standard for auto-battlers. While there is some strategy involved in how you place your units, the bulk of the strategy comes in planning between each fight where you outfit and upgrade your units. You buy items in shops that you find frequently in rooms, and once you give an item to a unit, they are irreversibly turned into that type of unit. There are 10 or so different classes of units you can find, and each class has 5 different varieties, with rare, more expensive varieties being generally better in all capacities. Despot's game has an interesting combo system that gives each class powerful abilities if you have enough different types, different rarities of units in a certain class. For example, if you have 3 or more types of gunner units, they all have increased attack speed in your fights. Throughout your run, there are a couple different things you have to balance team composition-wise. You have to have a mix of damage dealers and tanks. Often you have to have healers as well. You have to have a mix of both AoE and single target damage. And you have to have different types of units within each class so you can maximize those class buffs, get that increased damage, sustain, whatever it happens to be. You can also find mutations on each level that give general unit buffs or class-specific buffs depending on the mutation involved. Some of these buffs are insanely strong. So if you're running a certain class, getting the proper buffs for that class can feel like it really makes or breaks a given run at times. There are certain counter RNG measures there, so it is easier to get a certain mutation if you want to, but it's not always perfect. There's also a second way to get army-wide, team-wide mutations via the mutations tree, which you can think of as a team-wide skill tree. These upgrades include more health for your units, more attack speed for your units, those type of things. Buying units, items, and mutations from the mutation tree all cost gold. Additionally, you also have to buy food for your units, or they'll starve after a couple rooms without food. This food mechanic felt a little annoying to me at first when I first started playing, but eventually I realized you can actually get away with buying a lot less food than I originally thought. It became a lot less frustrating. Balancing whether to buy new, better units, or upgrade your mutation tree, or spend that cash on food is a difficult balancing act at times, and it's something that takes some time to get used to. It has a bit of a learning curve to it. In terms of the fights themselves, this is surprisingly one of the better areas of the game, despite being an auto-battler. The work and effort that was put into each unit, both your units and enemy units, is insane. And I absolutely loved all the animations in the game. It's a lot more engaging to watch the units' fights than some other auto-battlers that I've played. The enemy variety itself is decent, but there are some enemies that can hard counter your team comp unexpectedly. When I first started playing, I had a couple runs ended early, but discovering a new enemy type that hard countered my team composition. For example, I encountered a green lettuce monster that eats one melee unit that goes up to it after a period of time. There are some counters to it that I learned later on, but before I learned those, it felt like I basically just had to sacrifice a unit to get to the next level. This was very frustrating to deal with a lot of team comps, because it meant that I might lose 1 or 2 of my strongest tanks, which could effectively lose that run for me. And on that note, Despot's game is a game of attrition, and it's fairly difficult as a whole. You'll have a lot of units die, and you'll have a lot of unit turnover within each run. It's part of the game, and the damage the units take in one room carries over to the next. You'll have a lot of your first few runs in the game end pretty quickly, because you just don't know how to navigate the game, and you'll be punished for that. In the base game mode, you also have a 50-50 chance of recovering their item if a unit dies. And that's a very important coin flip if one of your strong unit dies. So there is some RNG baked into the game determining how well you will do. That said, once you've upgraded the shop, you can pretty reliably get what items you want for a certain team comp. Another source of RNG are the random events that you encounter at the start of each level. Which event you get is randomized, and the outcome of certain dialogue choices are also randomized. So you're never entirely sure what will happen when you choose a certain option. Outside of that RNG, the events themselves are generally entertaining and funny. The game doesn't take itself too seriously, and the pop culture references in the events are all well done. The game also already has a good amount of horizontal progression, with the ability to unlock different game modes and different starting units. These game modes include an easy and hard mode, as well as some other game modes that are more variety deviations, aka they're just as difficult as normal mode, but they have different modifiers. Each run also ends in a King of the Hill player versus player game mode, where your squad faces off against other teams to see how well you can do. And if you do well, you can place on a leaderboard. I don't usually care about leaderboards in roguelites, but the way that King of the Hill works in Despot's game was more engaging than a more typical traditional leaderboard. And I found myself more driven to improve on that, do better, get a higher score on future runs. The structure of the leaderboard also takes a lot of inspiration from ranked multiplayer games, with leagues and seasons and those types of things. Developers have stated they plan to expand this multiplayer game mode in the future, and I think that future game mode actually has a lot of potential to be really good. And on that note, let's talk about some other things that I want to see in the game. So right now, this game is a pretty solid foundation in a lot of ways. It doesn't feel unfinished at all. It is early access, so it is unfinished, but it doesn't feel that way. Still, there are some changes and improvements that I'd like to see added to the game. First, and most importantly, I have a broad criticism of the game that might be a little hard for the developers to actually address. And that criticism is, I don't think the Despot's game has a good learning experience. And I think there are a couple contributing factors to why that is the case. One is, as I talked about earlier, there are a lot of roadblocks you hit where a certain team composition can be hard countered or completely wiped by a certain enemy type that you see later on. Sometimes this is a fun learn by arrow situation that is typical of a lot of roguelites, and other times it's just incredibly frustrating because it feels unfair. Additionally, because as you get later on, you end up with a team of 40 to 50 units and maybe 4 to 5 different class types. It's really hard to know what is working or not working well within your team composition. I had a couple runs where I died and really had no idea what mistakes I made. I didn't know what to do better in the next run. Of course, I learned the basics of the game. I learned some important, powerful synergies, things like that. But a lot of things were difficult for me to figure out in a way that I didn't really enjoy. For example, there are some classes of units that I just never had any success with. And I can't tell if that's because they're bad, they're not balanced properly, or I'm not using them correctly, I don't have the right upgrades, or maybe they just didn't combo with the other units I had, what other upgrades I had on that run. I just don't know. Because it was so hard to tell what was working and what wasn't, it felt like there was some strategy in the game that I was just missing. And it's possible that I'll figure it out with more game time, but I'm not sure if that's the case. One potential solution for this problem is to give more unit information, like damage dealt, healing done, and tanked damage, either for each specific unit or, more helpfully, for a whole unit class together. For example, this might help me know whether it's worth my time to double down on mages or gunners in a certain run for DPS. Astronaut is another example of an auto-battler roguelite that provides that information, and it makes it a lot easier to tell what synergies are working on a given run and which ones are not. In Despot's game, you're really going in blind, and that hinders the learning experience, which, as a whole, hinders the enjoyment you can get from that game and makes it more frustrating at times. Outside of this larger issue, there are some smaller fixes that I would love to see. While I liked the dialogue in events, there are some dialogues that have a lot of clicks in order to get to the end. For example, after doing the death event several times, I didn't want to have to spam click 12 times to get through it. Having a skip to the end button would be nice after you've done the event once or twice. I would also like to see the ability to drag units. Right now you select them and then right click wherever you want them to go, which of course works fine, but I would just love the ability to drag units from where they are to where they should go, and I kept trying to do that in my first few playthroughs unsuccessfully. Outside of those things, despite it being an early access game, I never encountered any bugs or anything like that. The game feels pretty polished. So what's my verdict on Despot's game as it stands right now? This game does a lot of things really well. It has so much character to it, it has a good amount of unit variety, and it's fun to play through. But it suffers from being excessively punishing at times, at certain moments, and it can be incredibly difficult at times to learn what is and isn't working for you because of how the game is set up. Because the game already feels pretty complete, I would recommend it for those who are looking for more strategy, auto-battler roguelite, if that slightly steeper learning curve doesn't put you off. If those things aren't for you, it might be best to pass on this title for now and watch what comes out in the future updates. Also, as a channel update, earlier this week, I released new channel memberships for Insert Reviews. If you're interested in supporting the channel financially, you can join now at the $2 or $5 tiers, or whatever that happens to be in your regional currency. Both of these tiers will give you access to exclusive polls that will help decide what games I review in the future, and you'll also be featured at a thank you screen at the end of each video, starting next month. That being said, there will never be videos locked behind channel memberships. All content will always be accessible to all people. Thank you for your support of the channel, and thanks for watching.